Right, everyone. Good evening. Today is Tuesday, October 27th, and let's run through the market news of the day. To kick things off, we saw a slight fall in equity markets across the board. We saw futures decline just right now after the bell, and the dollar pushed slightly higher. Technology shares eked out gains on the news of advanced micro devices, AMD, pursuing their merger. This is a $35 billion takeover of another chip maker, and we'll dive into this in a bit. Considering the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones Industrial Average, we saw slight losses across the board. Then that was obviously continued out in Europe and APAC. Treasuries rallied as yields fell, and the 10-year was down about 3 more basis points to 77 basis points today. We saw the whole curve fall slightly. Volatility did, however, remain elevated as the possibility of the U.S. stimulus package being passed before next week's election on Tuesday did continue to dwindle. Bitcoin rose past 13,500, which is about to the level where it was going into the last crypto fall. WTI crude declined about 2% to 38.83 a barrel. Gold fell about 20 basis points as well to $1,905 an ounce. However, all of this is kind of in the backdrop to the big story, and that is next Tuesday's presidential election. Early voting turnout in the US election has already reached half of the 2016 total, so these moves are pretty substantial. This means that over 69 million ballots have been cast so far, and so there are 46.3 million votes cast by mail-in, and the remainder of which have been cast in person. Given, obviously, the public health crisis, a lot of people have been choosing to pursue mail-in voting. So there are 3 states that are ahead of the pack in terms of the highest percentage of the 2016 vote that has already been cast. We see about 87% of votes in Texas being cast, as well as 75% of Montana and 72% of North Carolina. Of 33 million ballots that were cast in states that do report party designation, 48% of those voting were Democrats, while 29% were Republicans, and 22% had no party affiliation. The remaining 1% belonged to minor parties. All right, AMD, big driver of the day, especially in the tech-focused NASDAQ. We saw AMD buying rival chipmaker Xilinx for $35 billion. This is an all-stock transaction that will create the industry's largest high-performance computing company, which will further bolster AMD's growing portfolio of different chips. This company will have about 13,000 employees, and the deal is expected to close at the end of 2021. AMD's stock did not react very well to the news, falling about 5% in pre-market trading. However, XLNX was up about 10%. Since Lisa Su became CEO, the company's shares have been up more than 1,300%. So we see substantial gains under her reign. Obviously, this is characterized by a pretty tough environment between US-China relations and also the obvious coronavirus crisis. In addition, just to touch on a couple other deals in the chip space for perspective, Intel has recently sold part of its memory chip business to SK Hynix, which is a Korean company, for about $9 billion US. This South Korean company is becoming the world's second biggest flash memory chip maker. And NVIDIA also has been active in M&A. Obviously, money is very cheap right now, so we see a lot of deal-making activity that did pause on the initial outbreak of COVID in February and March. NVIDIA acquired the UK-based chip designer ARM for about $16 billion US. And they are obviously known mainly for making chips for video game graphics. So it'll be great to get a bit of expansion there. Bringing it back to AMD, we saw a 56% jump in their top line, which is pretty substantial, bringing sales up to $2.8 billion US. This is the 4th straight quarter of greater than 25% year-over-year revenue growth. All right, 5 stories to talk about, and then we'll talk about what's ahead after that. Microsoft, the stock soared on cloud computing demand. Revenue in the latest period jumped a whopping 12% to $37.2 billion, which is 4% above analyst expectations. EPS increased about 32% to $1.82, which topped forecasts by 28 cents. The operating margin did come in slightly ahead of expectations there, with operating cost growth to only 3% in the last quarter. Commercial cloud, again, it's going to be a big driver right now, given the current work from home environment. Soared about 31% to 15.2 billion. So we see it representing a substantial portion of the company's top line, broader top line. Azure, the public cloud platform, had revenue climb about 47% as well, which is slowing slightly from the previous quarter, which was up 50%, but still 47% is pretty impressive growth. All right, Poland's biggest IPO has further raised expectations for foreign investors in the area. This has actually spurred more IPOs in the tech space that are likely to come and is becoming a European technology hub. Canal Plus Polska, the pay TV platform, is likely to IPO soon, as well as Huge, a mobile games platform, and the online clothing group Answear.com. 2 weeks ago, the e-commerce group Allegro launched on the Warsaw Stock Exchange, and the market cap was up about 63% on day one of trading to about 20 billion euros. So this is the biggest company on the exchange, pretty substantial because obviously it is not a state-owned enterprise. And the enterprise value of this company is already about 22 times its expected sales for the next 12 months, which is more than 5 times the multiple for Amazon. So there is a question of if it's overheated. As well, the dynamic in Poland is pretty interesting because Poland's government remains deeply ambivalent about foreign capital. The prime minister was a former banker at Santander. However, he notes that capital has a nationality and is a little bit worried about getting too much foreign capital into the country. Wells Fargo, continuing the theme talking about banking, I guess, hit its lowest share price since 2009 as investors await strategy arrangements. And Chief Executive Officer Charlie Scharf is supposed to come out with a strategy soon. And while we're waiting, the stock was down about 4% today. Sales of units, including the corporate trust business, the 10 billion US dollar student lending portfolio, and the $607 billion asset manager are likely to come soon. These divestitures should allow the firm to streamline its business. Wells Fargo is a little bit different than a lot of other banks in the US right now, because it is still under a Federal Reserve imposed asset cap. Thus, it has been one of the worst performing companies this year, and also specifically in the KBW Bank Index, with shares down about 60%. So they're down 59% on the year there, worse than the KBW Index, not very good performance. They are going to push for the removal of their asset cap before Biden does replace Fed officials, assuming he does win the presidency, because if he can act quickly, then it'll make sense that they're able to take advantage of the situation and rectify the problem at hand. This is likely to come in like 2021 or 2022 at the earliest. However, it could be pushed out to 2023. Analyst estimates are all over the place there. Airbnb is going to IPO on the NASDAQ exchange. They are notably choosing this over the New York Stock Exchange. They have the NASDAQ has frequently lost the competition for mega IPOs to the NYSE. So companies like Uber IPO'd for about 8.1 billion US dollars last year, and Snowflake did a nearly $4 billion offering also on the NYSE. Airbnb's offering will be the third biggest ever on the NASDAQ, the biggest one following Facebook in 2012, which did a $16 billion IPO. Mondelez International did a nearly $9 billion listing back in 2001 at the height of the tech bubble. All right, so they're seeking to raise as much as 3 billion US dollars in their IPO before the end of the year, and they were valued at 18 billion in April and used that valuation to raise about 2 billion in debt. Again, being in April, that's near the depth of the pandemic, so things were pretty bad then. However, this is a significant drop from its peak valuation of about 32 billion US dollars in the 2017 fundraising round. They also did decide to split their privately held shares this week, with the value of the shares climbing about 11% from its last valuation. So these shares are going to be obviously not publicly traded, but listed in values for the IRS. And common shares were valued about $35 a piece as of September 30th. All right, last main story to talk about in Q8, we did see a rate cut from its central bank, which is really interesting because, like central banks around the world, their rates were around 275 basis points for their equivalent of the FFR, the federal funding rate in Kuwait. But rates are now around 12 and a half basis points. So the Federal Reserve in the US targets a range between 0 and 25 basis points now. And Q8 will now target this 12 and a half basis point. And so this is a 12 and a half basis point cut, lowering the repo rates and the yields on short-term deposits, direct intervention instruments, and public debt instruments across the entire yield curve. Obviously, in Kuwait, though, it does only go out to 10 years. It's not 30 like in the US, or you've got gilts that'll go out to 100 years. So you don't have that, just going out to 100 years. And this change in rates will come into effect on Wednesday. Unlike a lot of their peers in the Gulf region, Kuwait did drop much more aggressively and was the only country in the GCC to also cut rates by 100 basis points, just like the Fed did. The central bank exuded the sentiment that this further bolsters the attractiveness of Kuwaiti dinars. So we'll look forward to see more FX trends down the line. All right, looking ahead, what can we do for the rest of the week? Firstly, the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee is meeting. They're having their all-important plenum, which means that they're going to chart the course for the economy's development over the next 15 years. This is looking out to the long term and figuring out what the economy's plan is going to look like. In terms of Brexit negotiations, we see both sides of the table starting to push to finalize a deal. We do have this deadline for the middle of November, and these discussions are likely to continue and further accelerate as both sides push to finalize a deal. So two more central banks to talk about, the Bank of Japan and the ECB. Both have monetary policy decisions on Thursday. We're not expecting much movement. However, Governor Kuroda and President Lagarde should have interesting commentary, so I highly suggest tuning in and listening to that. In the United States, we do have our third quarter GDP readings likely to come out on Thursday, and it's anticipated to actually be the strongest on record coming out of the coronavirus recovery. This will follow the record dive in the prior quarter. So we see this number being very volatile recently, as many businesses were shuttered by the pandemic. However, this rebound should be captured in these GDPs, and they're likely to be incredibly impressive. All right, well, that about sums it up. Looking forward to seeing you Thursday for the 22nd episode of Market Newsflow. Thank you so much for the time, and have a great evening.